So we continue and finish our journey here for this month. And this month we've been talking about developing our spiritual core. So to those of you who are kind of jumping into the conversation, I'll just give a little bit about what that means. Spiritual core is to develop ourselves spiritually so that when things happen in the world around us, we're ready. So that we don't fall apart completely, or we know how to handle them. Maybe fall apart for a little bit, but we rise up again and do what we need to do and connect with that spirituality within us and around us. Just like in physical fitness, you're taught to develop your core. Much of athletic activity requires you to have a core. Even walking requires you to have a strong core. So all of this is part of taking this idea of the physicality and thinking about what that means in the spiritual realm. How is it that we rise above chaos and fear that's always around us? Is it not? No, it's not here now, right? No chaos and fear. Yeah. Around us. We sometimes don't want to name it, but that's the truth. It's around us. And so how do we stand up to that? How do we develop our spiritual core, which is that deep reservoir of power, so that when the world around us seems like it's crumbling, we're ready. We're ready. Make sense? So in the last few weeks, we've been talking about a few different elements. We started with this idea of strength, and I looked at the book of Esther in the Old Testament. And then we moved on and we looked at this idea of flexibility. And I talked a little bit about how Jesus' ministry was all about just rolling with it, right? Jesus would preach where he needed to preach. He would do things in the way he needed to do. He adapted, he adjusted. It was all about that flexibility, being flexible in mind, being flexible in connecting with others. And then last week, we talked about this idea of strength that we use sometimes in a toxic or unbalanced way. How do we sometimes think that we must continue to hold it all up so that we're carrying the weight of the world or the weight of our past or the weight of our families here, and that's not spiritual development. That's not spiritual strength. That's just being in a static state. When we develop, when we grow those muscles, we have to let them drop. Just like a heavy weight lifter is going to not hold these up, forever. They're dropped. So we talked about that. Now today, we get to have some fun talking about the concept of spiritual balance. What does that mean? When we think about, again, from a physical standpoint, physical activity requires balance. Most athleticism requires balance. I saw a gentleman on the other day as I was driving in Nashville, and he's literally in the front of his lawn, 2 trees, and he's got a tightrope, and he's training in front of his lawn on a tightrope. That requires an amazing amount of balance. But even things like walking, breathing, all of these functions physically that we do in our lives require balance. I once, years ago, decided that I wanted to train for a marathon. And when I started this program, I decided to go to a program. I saw the list, and so it was like run a little bit here and then run for 15 minutes, 10 minutes. It was sort of this progressive thing. And I thought, how am I going to ever get to run 26.2 miles with this schedule like this? It seemed odd to me. My logical mind, or my mind that's so accustomed to, as Americans, right, as Westerners, we're like, get it done, go for it, go for the gusto, go big, go home. We push ourselves. And so for me, this idea of pacing seemed a little strange. But then I, gave into it, and obviously that's how it is. In an athletic regimen, right, you gradually are building, you're gradually building, and then some days you push yourself, and then what do? You rest. And then you start building, and you start building to the next level, and then you push yourself, and then you come back and you rest. That's how much of physical training is done, right? And it's very much the same with spiritual training. We have to sometimes push ourselves, but it's progressive. It's progressive, but there's also this way in which we have to balance the push with the rest. When I first was signing on to come here to Unity of Nashville, one of the things that I was really adamant about was having Sundays off. And that was a little odd for the board because the history here in this community has been that ministers do every Sunday. And so that was part of a negotiation with us, and it was part of also an educational moment for us to understand where I was coming from in that. Typically now in the field of ministry, at least one Sunday off for a minister is pretty much status quo. And knowing that was fine, but there was something for me that was driving my need for that more than anything. I was given a prayer partner at Unity Convention in the Great Lakes. They have an annual convention, and they have a time where you can apply for a prayer partner. So about 3 years ago, I decided I'd do that. It just sort of came to me like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I want a prayer partner. A month later, I get a call. They said, we have a prayer partner that's signed up. We can pair you. This person is a spiritual leader in Michigan. Would you be willing to pair up? Sure. So without knowing who she was, I didn't meet her, had never seen her. We decided to do a week. Every week we had our Thursday at 1 o'clock phone call. This went on for about 2.5 years through the pandemic. One day I call her at 1 o'clock, just like I always do on a Thursday, and she answers the phone. And I said, hi, how are you? You ready for a prayer time? And she says, I'm in the hospital. I'm actually in the ER. And I said, what happened? And she said, the ministry finally got me. And then the phone went dead. So I'm panicked, like, what does that mean? What's happening? What's going on? And so I called her back, I texted her back, I continued to try to reach her over the next days. It wasn't until several weeks later that her daughter reached out to me and said, I want to let you know that she's had a stroke. So she had a stroke, she went through different types of rehabilitation, yada, yada, yada. But what ended up happening is about 3 months later, she passed. That to me was a huge wake-up call because I've heard these stories in the ministry, like one of my mentors at ministerial school and instructors who had been asking his board for years for a sabbatical, and they kept saying, it's not the right time, we're busy, we need you, you have to be here, everybody's looking towards you for spiritual direction. And so he kept putting it off, till one day he too had a stroke. Luckily, he did make it. But instead of being out for a few months like he was asking his board, he ended up being out for like a year. So I bring this to your attention to say that for me, that was important to do. And yet, as human beings sometimes, and I was fortunate that the board was able to work with me around that was something, my spiritual development, my spiritual time and my rest time, I had to make a place for. And yet, even though I did that, I came here and I started working, and I started working, and I started working. And so the Sundays I did take off, where was I? I was on the live stream with my live stream peeps, hey, and I loved it. So I would take Sunday off, but I was on the live stream with folks. I was managing the Unity of Nashville page. Maybe I was doing things in the background here with staff and with tech. Even the days then later, I thought, okay, this is not good. If I'm going to take off, I take off. And so I did, but I'm still on the Unity page. I'm still, giving shout outs to everybody, still commenting, doing all that. So I wasn't taking off. I wasn't saying and doing what I said I was going to do. And so I just kept going until a few weeks ago, my body said, not working. And I ended up having a vertigo episode. I suffer from vertigo, but I haven't had an episode in about 4 years, and all of a sudden it came on. Does anybody know what vertigo is? Vertigo ultimately is about imbalance, right? It's this inner ear where the crystals in your ears they think are not in balance, but it ultimately is about imbalanced. And I had to come to terms as a person that my life had become imbalanced, that I was working all the time, that I would take little breaks here and there, or that I said I would take time off, but I was still, just that one email, just that one memo, just that one phone call, just that one text, right? But you're still in that time. Does anybody relate to that? Where you're kind of going and going and going, and you're pretending that you're resting, but you're really not. Or maybe your rest day is, I've got one day off, and I'm going to take this rest day, but what are you doing? Maybe you're washing clothes, you're running errands, you're out and about, you're still in the hustle and bustle, you're not resting. I bring this to y'all's attention, not because I want anybody's sympathy, not because I'm complaining, because I love what I do. I love what I do, but it's bringing it to your attention so that you understand I too have that I'm working with as a human being. We're all working with it. Now let's layer in all of the regular things in life with family and friends and careers and work to what's happening globally. Do you know that there's actually a term, I didn't know this, that they call COVID fatigue? Has anyone heard that? COVID fatigue. And so this idea that because of the pandemic, we have become tired, even more so than usual. But it has to do with what's happening cognitively as well as physically. It has to do with this idea of what is happening to us in our bodies that are creating the situation. So even though the pandemic is sort of subsiding, right, we're still faced with the effects of what it has done to us. They call it too, this idea in science, the doctors and the psychologists and scientists are also calling it, it's part of this idea of called general adaptation syndrome, that we're not adapting, that we haven't adapted to some of our new environments. We didn't adapt even through the pandemic of how we dealt with what happened when we were in enclosure, when we were in isolation, when we were in fear. And there hasn't been enough spaces and places for us as human beings to actually grieve those things, to actually talk about those things, to actually allow those things to move through our body and release so that they can be transformed. So all of that anxiety, all of that emotion, all of that fear, all of those things that we held are still here. So oftentimes some of you may be feeling odd and you don't know why. You might be feeling tired and you don't know why. You might be feeling anxious and you don't know why. You might be feeling overwhelmed and you don't know why. You might be feeling like you can't stand the littlest change in your life because it takes you over the edge. Anybody there? This is normal. And then we add to that, we add to how we're feeling, the guilt and the shame, like, right, mea culpa, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I'm good economically. I have a job. I have a great family. All the guilt that we place on ourselves for having these feelings that are completely and totally natural. Scientifically, what's happening is we've been in a period of grief and stress and drama and trauma that creates something in our bodies that we actually have to deal with. It's taxing our system. Think about some of these things. We have been pushed to our limits in the last 2 years, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and cognitively as well. Think about all the million things that you had to think about and still think about on a daily basis. Should I wear one mask or two? Should I wear the blue one or the flowered one? It sounds silly, but all of these things, should I mask up or not? Oh, I went to that store and I touched something. Oh, did I actually put sanitizer on my hands after that? And then you start worrying, did I catch something? Did I get something? I know that's me sometimes, right? All the questions that we have to deal with. And it sounds silly. It sounds silly at one level, but it's all the little minute things that we're having to make decisions about, that we're having to give and take about, that we're having to stress about, that ultimately create this issue with us. Well, I don't want to say issue, create a situation with us where we're cognitively exhausted. And so all of us have to understand these are tumultuous and overwhelming times. And so this is the reason why I'm bringing this to everyone's attention in terms of spiritual development, so that we can persevere, that we can stay the course, and that when other things happen that add to it, because don't we feel like, we're like, oh, the pandemic is moving out, and then all of a sudden what happens? Ukraine, really? Really? Right? It's like, well, people talk about the Groundhog Day. Like, it's like every day we're reliving this chaos, we're reliving this drama, we're reliving this. Like, what is this? It just feels like it never ends, right? Who's with me on that? Is it just me? Yeah. It's like it's never ending. But guess what? That is part of what we get to do in this spiritual practice, is build up those spiritual muscles so that we're ready for it, and that we claim the truth of who we are. Because no matter what is happening around us, we have the spiritual resources at our disposal. We are connected to divine mind. We are divine mind expressing, so that everything that has happened or will happen or could happen in the world is part of the expression that we have within us at a cellular level. What does that mean? That means that we can connect to peace at any moment. We can connect to joy at any moment. We can connect to calm at any moment. But it takes that practicing for us, and it takes that recognition that we are out of balance. I want to move quickly into a little bit of scripture, because I love using scripture as a way for us to also illustrate what we're talking about, and also to see how, Jesus' ministry is sharing with us this wisdom so that we can move through life. It's a blueprint for us to sort of not do by the letter, but to be able to sort of understand, how does this apply to my life? What am I getting from this particular passage or this particular character? Or how am I each of those characters in this scripture? We're going to turn to Luke. This is chapter 10, verse 38 to 42. And this is where Jesus is visiting Mary and Martha. Now, last week we talked about Lazarus. And Lazarus are the sisters of, Mary and Martha are the sisters of Lazarus. So there's all kind of the connection here. And so here's what it says. Now as they went on their way, he entered a certain village, where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. What's going on here? So we have the two sides of us, right? Mary and Martha represent those two sides. That maybe even in a relationship, one person sort of balances out one side or the other. But within us, those are those two people, where it's sort of the business side, the logical side, the focus side, maybe even the masculine side, if you look at it from that perspective. Not masculine as in male, but masculine as in spiritual essence, where it's the doer. Get the task done, get her done, right? That's what my prayer partner would always say, get her done. So that kind of side to us. And then there's the other side, where it's more, I want to be in this feeling moment. I want to enjoy it. I want to be at the feet of Jesus and just listen and experience this and be in community and have fun and just understand what's happening here, enjoying the moment, being in that feeling nature, right? So those two sides are part of us. When Jesus said to us here that there's only one thing that matters, the one thing that matters to us here he's talking about is balance. This is what matters, balancing those two sides in our lives so that one is not overpowering the other, and that we're also understanding that we must take our time of rest, that it's not just about going and going and going. I know some of you who are retired, and man, your schedule is like, whoosh, pull out the scroll, And that's a wonderful thing sometimes to have that. But I also invite you to think about how oftentimes in our lives we become busy as a way to avoid. Think about that for a second. I remember Vero telling me the other day, my wife Vero saying to me, Her spiritual teacher told her one time, and it stuck with her, and now it's stuck with me, that he said, the hardest thing and yet the most powerful thing as human beings that we can do is just be still. Can you still, not being on Netflix, right? Not being texting, not doing this, all these other, but just sitting. Therein lies the power of one of the tools that Unity brings to this conversation and other spiritual traditions bring to this conversation is the idea of meditation, where we're saying you need to just be still. You need to quiet the mind and do nothing and allow for whatever is happening in that time, whether you're still in the monkey mind and thinking about the laundry, or whether you have this moment where you actually are connecting. It's just a split second in a 20-minute sit down. That's all it takes. I say almost every week, spiritual connection is not about quantity. It is about quality. Because we think we need to sit somewhere and it's like an hour. The filmers would talk about they would sit in meditation for hours, like 8 hours. Can anyone imagine? Wow, that's discipline. But we don't have to do that. If you sit for 10 minutes and you get 30 seconds of this clarity, have you ever done that where you get this 30 seconds, 10 seconds of this, something happened and you can't explain it and you don't know what happened, but something felt different, something moved. Guess what? You did the work. You built your spiritual core. And the more you practice, the more it opens up and the longer that time is, and the more that you don't have to sit in meditation, you're walking down the street and all of a sudden it's like, ooh, I just got some Jesus juice, right? I just got some God energy. I just got something. And you don't know because you're practicing. It starts to come through in the most beautiful, mundane, unexpected ways as we practice. So we're balancing these things, so that we're continuing to contact ourselves with the Christ mind. This is the idea that we're talking about here ultimately, is contacting with that other, contacting with that spirit. I don't care what you call it. If you call it God, if you call it spirit, if you call it mother, if you call it father, if you call it Lord, the name does not matter. It's the effect that matters ultimately. That you're doing that connection, that you're taking that time to be at the feet. I want to share with you before we move into meditation a couple things from Charles Fillmore. And he was writing interpretations of the Bible in the early 1900s. And these particular answers are around questions he was asked about Mark 6 when Jesus fed the 5,000. But they're equally applicable because we're talking about balance and rest. So he was asked, are rest and relaxation part of the divine law? And so he answers, they are part of both natural and divine law. In other words, of universal law. The ebb and flow of the tide, the inhaling and exhaling of the breath, the rhythm of the heartbeat and pulse all reveal the law of balance or of action and reaction in the natural world. So then he's asked, well, what follows a season of intense activity for the faculties? And the faculties are sort of those power centers that we talk about, right? All throughout the body. And so he answers, a season of lessened activity or dormancy, if not of complete rest, as in sleep. Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. That was from scripture that Jesus says to the disciples. Come ye yourselves apart in a desert place and rest a while. Such a season of dormancy allows the faculties, which he also calls the disciples, the faculties in our body also are the disciple centers, the power centers. It allows for those disciples within us to become renewed and ready for fuller exercise. So today we're going to practice that. I'm going to invite our musician back up here, David back up to guide us here in meditation. So we're going to start, and I'm going to guide you initially, and then we're going to have a beautiful poem by Miss Sylvia Driggins as part of our meditation experience. So if you want to kind of come on up, and I'll get us ready here. So I invite you all to close your eyes. Close your eyes and take a few deep cleansing breaths. Allow yourself to relax into this space and place. Allow your body to relax. And as you allow your body to relax and your breath to breathe you allow for this calm, this balance, this connection. And we invoke that higher self, that Christ consciousness that moves and lives and breathes in us as us. We are connected to the one presence and the one power. We are the one presence and the one power. And as we close our eyes, we open up that inner eye of the knowing and the being. And as we open up, we come to this space with allowing for the information, for the recognition of balance in our lives. And we also open up for the space of recognition and admission for where our lives may be out of balance. Where do you need to restore? Where do you need to renew? Is it in your family? Is it in your romantic relationship? Is it in your job? Is it with yourself? Is it with some obsession that you have? Is some worry that you have? Where are you out of balance in your life that you need to get back to that spiritual core, to that home, to that God home within? So I invite you to listen to these beautiful words as you continue in your state of meditation, as you continue to sit at the feet of truth right now and allow for that realignment and divine order.